An atheist journalist thought he had the perfect argument, his confidence unshaken, his logic seemingly airtight, until Caroline Leavitt hit him with a story so powerful, it changed everything. The stage was set. Bright studio lights poured down over the sleek, ultra-modern set of American Perspectives Tonight, a primetime show famous for its fiery political and cultural debates. Millions of viewers across the country had tuned in, knowing this wasn't just going to be a discussion, it was going to be a battle of ideas, a clash of convictions. At the center of it all sat Caroline Leavitt, a rising political firebrand, known for her unshakable stance and sharp wit. Poised, composed, she exuded the confidence of someone who had stood in the fire before and never flinched. Across from her, Alan Brooks, a veteran journalist with a reputation for being brutally direct, unfiltered, and relentless. His questioning had dismantled seasoned politicians, exposed inconsistencies, and left no argument unchallenged. He was the kind of interviewer who didn't just ask tough questions, he cornered his guests, forcing them to defend their beliefs with everything they had. The energy in the room was thick with anticipation. Not just from the live studio audience, but from the unseen millions watching from their homes. The topic of the night was framed as a discussion on leadership and policy, but everyone knew it was about more than that. It was about values, about ideology, about something deeper, something personal. For the first 20 minutes, it was a back and forth of standard political discourse, economics, government regulations, social issues. Caroline met each rapid-fire question with precision, her answers articulate, well-prepared, delivered with the kind of clarity that made people listen. She wasn't just speaking, she was connecting. Her voice carried beyond the studio walls, reaching through the screens, resonating with people who believed as she did. Then a shift. Subtle, but undeniable. Alan adjusted in his chair, his eyes narrowing just slightly, an almost imperceptible move, but one that seasoned debaters would recognize instantly. He wasn't just leading the conversation anymore. He was setting a trap. He was going for something personal. The entire studio seemed to tighten, as if everyone, producers, camera operators, even the audience, could sense it. "Caroline," he said, his voice measured, careful. "You've often spoken about faith being a guiding principle in your leadership. You've even argued that faith has a role in shaping public policy." She nodded, waiting. "But let's be honest," he continued, leaning forward slightly. "Religion, Christianity in particular, is declining in this country. More people than ever don't believe in a higher power. Science has given us answers that faith never could. And yet you continue to advocate for faith as if it's some kind of universal truth. Why?" A murmur rippled through the audience. It wasn't just a question, it was a challenge. Caroline didn't answer immediately. She let the words hang in the air, absorbing their weight. This wasn't just about her faith. Alan was questioning the relevance of faith itself. He continued, pressing the moment. There are millions of people who believe faith is nothing more than an outdated crutch, something that holds people back rather than moves them forward. Would you say that's a fair argument? Or are you simply unwilling to admit that faith is losing its place in modern America? The silence was electric. People shifted in their seats. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every subtle movement, every flicker of expression, every shift in body language. Alan had lit a match, tossed it onto dry ground, and now everyone was waiting to see if Caroline would let it burn, or if she'd put out the fire with something unexpected. She didn't rush. Instead, she took a breath, tilted her head slightly, and then just the faintest hint of a knowing smile. She knew exactly what to say next. Alan leaned back, tapping his pen against the desk, waiting. The audience held its breath. "You say faith is an outdated crutch," Caroline said finally, her voice steady. "That it holds people back. But let me ask you something, Alan." She tilted her head, her eyes sharp. "What do people turn to when science doesn't have an answer?" Alan's lips twitched, but he didn't interrupt. "You see," she continued, her tone unwavering, "it's easy to dismiss faith when life is comfortable, when everything is going well, when your job is secure, when your family is healthy, when the world makes sense. But when the ground beneath you collapses, When your child is lying in a hospital bed, fighting for their life, when you're standing over a casket, when the doctor looks at you and says, "I'm sorry, there's nothing more we can do." Her voice didn't waver, but the weight of her words settled like a stone in the room. What do you reach for then? Dead silence. Even the producers, usually whispering behind the cameras, were frozen. Alan adjusted his tie, maintaining eye contact. But his demeanor had shifted, just slightly. People turn to faith because they're desperate, he countered. That doesn't make it real. That makes it comforting. Caroline nodded slightly, as if she had expected that response. Comfort is not a weakness, Alan. It's human. And faith? Faith is more than just comfort. It's resilience. It's hope. It's the belief that, even in the darkest moments, there's still meaning. You can call that naive, but I'd argue it's the very thing that has kept people from collapsing under the weight of suffering for thousands of years. Alan exhaled slowly, shifting in his chair. So, you're saying belief is necessary for survival? I'm saying belief is what makes survival mean something, she answered. He let out a faint smile, shaking his head slightly. You're good, Caroline. But he wasn't done. He gestured with his hand, resetting. But let's talk facts. Religion has been responsible for some of the worst atrocities in history. Wars, oppression, corruption. And yet, you defend faith as if it's only ever been a force for good. Caroline didn't flinch. I won't deny that people have done terrible things in the name of religion. But let's be fair, faith has also been the foundation for some of the greatest acts of courage, sacrifice, and kindness the world has ever seen. The abolition of slavery, the civil rights movement, the countless hospitals, schools, and charities started by people who believed their faith called them to serve others. You can't erase that just because some have twisted faith for their own agendas. Alan studied her, searching for the next move. But Caroline leaned in slightly, taking control of the moment. If you really want to know why I believe in faith, why I defend it, it's not because of history. It's not because of politics. She paused. Between Alan's furrowed brows, there was a flicker of something, curiosity, hesitation, maybe even the beginnings of doubt. Caroline noticed it. She nodded, her voice softening just slightly. Her name was Margaret, she said, a quiet intensity settling over her. And she taught me something about faith that no debate, no argument, no matter how logical, could ever shake. The audience, Alan, even the crew behind the cameras, no one was prepared for what she was about to say. Caroline rested her hands on the table, her fingers gently interlaced. She wasn't just answering a question anymore. She was telling a story. One that carried more weight than facts, statistics, or any philosophical debate ever could. She was 72 years old when I met her, Caroline began. I was fresh out of college, working as a legislative assistant in Nashville. My days were filled with meetings, answering calls, drafting statements. Politics was everything to me back then. I thought policy was the most powerful force in the world. She exhaled slightly. But then I met Margaret. Alan remained silent, his usual sharp expression unreadable. But he wasn't looking at his notes anymore. He was listening. And so was everyone else. It was a community outreach event for seniors, Caroline continued. One of those events that politicians love to show up to, shake hands, take a quick photo, and leave. But I wasn't there for that. I was there to do my job, take notes, listen politely, and move on. She let out a small breath, as if the memory itself was pressing against her. But Margaret, she stopped me in my tracks. The audience was still. Even the soft hum of the cameras seemed to quiet. It wasn't because she was loud or demanding attention. She was actually quite soft-spoken. But there was something about her, something unshakable. Caroline's gaze didn't waver. She carried herself with a quiet strength, the kind that only comes from surviving things that should have broken you. Alan's expression remained still, but his body language had changed. He wasn't just listening, he was absorbing every word. She had buried 2 sons, Caroline said, her voice steady, but filled with emotion. One died from cancer. The other was killed by a drunk driver. She lost her husband to a stroke. She had no siblings, no close family left. Caroline swallowed slightly. And yet, she sat across from me, smiling, sipping tea, asking me how my life was going. For the first time, Alan blinked, his fingers stilling against the desk. I remember looking at her, trying to understand how she could endure so much pain and still be her. Still warm, still kind, as if the world hadn't tried to take everything from her. Caroline turned slightly, her gaze settling directly on Alan, not as an opponent, but as a person. So I asked her, she said quietly, how do you do it? How do you survive that kind of loss and still wake up in the morning? Alan didn't move. No one did. Caroline took a breath. And she told me something I will never forget. She looked at Alan, her voice firm but gentle. She said, faith isn't about proof. It's about what keeps you standing when there is none. Silence. Thick, deafening silence. Even the faint murmur of the cameras seemed to vanish. Every morning, Caroline continued, she woke up and thanked God. Not because her life had been easy. Not because she had been spared suffering. But because she was still here. Because even after everything, every loss, every heartbreak, she still believed her days had purpose. She exhaled slowly. I was 22 years old. I thought I understood strength. But Margaret showed me what it really looked like. Caroline let the words settle. Alan opened his mouth slightly, as if about to speak. But then, he hesitated. He shut it again, pressing his lips together. And before he could find the right words, Caroline added something that changed everything. Alan's mouth remained slightly open, as if he wanted to argue but couldn't quite form the words. The weight of Caroline's story filled the room, pressing down on everyone. The audience, normally quick to react, whisper, shift in their seats, was completely still. Even the host, usually eager to move things along, hesitated. Caroline didn't rush to fill the silence. She let it stretch. Alan finally cleared his throat, shifting slightly. That's a powerful story, he admitted, his voice quieter than before. But don't you think it's just that? A story? Margaret found something that worked for her. That doesn't mean faith is some universal truth. Caroline nodded slightly, as if she'd anticipated that response. You're right about one thing, she said. Faith isn't about proving something to other people. It's about what people live through. And if you listen, really listen, you'll hear that story told a million different ways. Alan exhaled, rubbing the bridge of his nose. But see, that's my issue, Caroline, he said finally. Faith isn't measurable. It's built on emotions, experiences, things that can't be quantified. And yet, people use it to justify decisions that affect everyone. Caroline tilted her head slightly. You mean like hope? Alan blinked. What? Hope, she repeated. It's not measurable. It's not scientific. You can't put it under a microscope. And yet, people fight wars for it. They survive the impossible because of it. They hold on to it, even when logic says they shouldn't. She let that sink in before continuing. Would you tell someone who just lost their home in a tornado that their hope is just an emotional crutch? That their belief in something better isn't real, just because it can't be measured? Alan shifted again, but didn't interrupt. That's the thing about faith, Caroline said. It's not about controlling people. It's not about forcing a belief onto anyone. It's about how people make sense of the hardest parts of life. You can call it irrational, but when someone loses everything and still gets up the next day, still finds the strength to keep going, there's something in that. Something you can't measure, but you also can't ignore. Alan's fingers tapped lightly against the desk. His usual sharpness had softened. He wasn't just debating anymore. He was thinking. The host finally interjected, sensing the shift. Alan, do you have a response to that? Alan opened his mouth, then closed it. He glanced at the audience, almost as if searching for some kind of reaction to anchor himself. But no one spoke. No one moved. When he finally answered, his voice lacked its earlier edge. I think I need to process that. A murmur rippled through the audience. It wasn't the dramatic rebuttal they had expected. It wasn't an explosive takedown. It wasn't a win or a loss. It was something far more rare. A moment of honesty. But the real reaction, the one that would send shockwaves across the country, was still to come. The debate wrapped up moments later, but the conversation? Far from over. Alan removed his mic, stood up, and without a word, walked straight off stage. He didn't stop for small talk. He didn't stay for post-show commentary. His posture was stiff, his thoughts elsewhere. Caroline, however, remained seated for a moment longer. She could hear the whispers among the crew. She could see the way the audience exchanged glances. Some looked moved. Others looked unsettled. But no one looked unaffected.